Our next speaker is Professor Josh Byrne, who's Dean of Sustainable Futures at Curtin University. Josh is an environmental scientist, landscape designer, author, research academic and avid gardener, and is well known for his role as WA presenter on ABC TV's Gardening Australia program. Now his expertise includes sustainable urban development, and tonight Josh will address how medium density infill and nature can coexist, covering urban greening and tree canopy. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. So it might seem an unusual pairing, medium density development and nature in urban spaces. And continuing from Peter's theme of rejuvenation and regeneration, this is, I guess, the framing that I want to put forward for this presentation. Peter shared a photo of him in his early years and mentioned what inspired his career. So I was fortunate to get a glimpse of Peter's slides last night, so I thought I'd be cheeky and put a photo of me as a younger man in my natural habitat, which is up a mulberry tree in my student rental garden in Cersei Circle in Dalkeith. So this is my old haunts as well. Out of interest, who remembers my infamous garden in Cersei Circle in Dalkeith? I thought there'd be a few. The first permaculture garden in the open garden scheme back in the day, and of course where I got my first gig with ABC Gardening Australia, now nearly 25 years ago, would you believe. But for me, there are moments like Peter where things really influence your life. So look, I found a deep passion for gardening as a teenager. I was a closet gardener back then because it wasn't the coolest thing. I came out in my early 20s when I was studying environmental science and sustainability at Murdoch University, and it's when I also met Peter. So a couple of key things happened for me. Being someone who grew up in the western suburbs with plenty of space to garden and a sense that larger spaces were the norm. When I was in that student garden, and I must say I was able to rent that house for 6.5 years with the same group of bachelors during our student heyday for $200 a week. That's for the whole house, for a quarter-acre block in Cersei Circle in Dalkeith. And it came with a key to the Dalkeith Primary School pool across the road. So things were pretty good back in the mid-90s. So space and rent accommodation wasn't really an issue. But what did happen was we had major droughts during the mid to late 90s, and we saw the introduction of the first water restrictions for Perth gardeners. That made a big impact on me. The other thing that made a big impact was meeting Peter Newman as an undergraduate student and hearing his lectures on transport planning and how to do cities better. So Peter and I developed a wonderful working relationship pretty much from that moment on. And it did inform my direction. I ended up doing a PhD with Peter as one of my supervisors, looking at urban landscapes and how we can manage those with declining availability of water. Of course, alongside this, developing a career in the media through Gardening Australia, setting up a consulting practice with a team of landscape architects and urban designers, and then ultimately, again, with a lot of encouragement and guidance from Peter, ending up in academia as a dean and a professor of all things, but still very much a gardener at heart. And a couple of things still drive my passion for what I do across all of these fields, which I still continue to practice in. And that is, how do we do cities better? And how the green spaces get incorporated into cities that we can design better, denser, smarter and much more efficient. So with that as a bit of framing, I thought I would just touch on some of the benefits of urban green spaces, just in case you weren't already convinced. So the topic of tonight's presentation is, how does nature and denser or urban infill coexist? My reframing of that really is, the only way we can do developments well at all is by ensuring that green spaces are properly integrated into the planning, design, delivery and maintenance of our habitat. Keeping in mind that cities now are the major habitat for humanity, including in this country. So we know that urban green spaces provide support for biodiversity. I'll tap into that a bit further shortly. But it also provides opportunities for better stormwater infiltration, provides noise buffering, improves air quality, and there is an overwhelming evidence base for all of these key benefits. Urban greening, when done well, also helps with climate change mitigation. And by that, we're talking about how we can reduce energy use, reduce emissions, and it's done in several ways. Firstly, through strategic shading. How do we landscape in such ways where we improve the thermal performance of the buildings that we live and work in? How do we cool high thermal mass spaces around our buildings to reduce cooling loads, particularly in a warming climate? We know also through extensive studies that high amenity spaces, shaded walkways and the like means less use of private cars because people are happier to walk and ride, certainly locally, and more use e-mobility devices as well. And there's also a growing body of work around how can we actually calculate the carbon sequestration opportunities within urban green spaces. Challenging because it's not yet supported under the national carbon offsetting accounting schemes, but we know through good science and management there may be possibilities there. But urban greening also helps with climate change adaptation. So moving on from mitigation, it's recognising that we are seeing climate change and even with the most aspirational transition to a low carbon future, we are seeing the impacts of climate change now. And adaptation is how do we build resilience into our lives, our livelihoods and our lifestyles. So firstly, urban greening helps reduce the impact of heat waves. So we are seeing increased numbers of days in the high 30s and low 40s and higher nighttime temperatures, which is the real risk because homes aren't cooling down. So by having good green spaces, we provide localised urban cooling. Reducing of flash flooding through localised stormwater infiltration. Providing critical biodiversity linkages to reduce the likelihood of genetic stranding. And this is really important. So it's about how do we ensure the flow of genetics of plants, but particularly fauna, and fauna that can't get up and fly away, but is only able to move through physically connected corridors rather than having genetics stranded in small isolated areas. And also green spaces can provide opportunities for local food production, which increases resilience too. And if that's not enough, guess what? We've also got a huge body of evidence that tells us that gardening is really good for us. Green spaces are really good for us. Just spending time in urban green spaces, whether it's private gardens, parks, reduces stress, increases attention levels and aids with mental restoration. So it begs the question, why wouldn't you? Thankfully, there is also leadership. And you're probably picking up a tone of Peter Newman optimism here in my presentation because there's lots of really dumb stuff being done too. But we know about that. Let's focus on the good stuff and make change. So what kind of leadership are we seeing locally in this space for urban greening? Well, we are seeing leadership by the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. The Design WA suite of guiding documents for precincts and for apartments. The original version of the Medium Density Design Code was fantastic. Unfortunately, it's watered down. So let's push for getting the original one back, and I'll touch more on that as we move through. Also, the urban greening strategy, which is currently in the stakeholder engagement phase led by DPLH, is also very promising. Let's make sure we get something that's really useful and not just another document. But there's the potential for this to be a leadership document. We're seeing great leadership from local government and WALGA as the West Australian Local Government Association being advocates for urban forest strategies and action plans. Water Corporation, an unlikely bedfellow in this space, like many water utilities around Australia, 10 odd years ago started to really get behind working with industry, helping gardeners transition to low water gardening and recognising that, just turning the water off and paving is not a good outcome. and that through good guidance on plant selection, gardening practices, and even going so far as helping to promote verge gardening, and my team and I were very involved in developing the Authorised verge program policies and guidance documents, which Water Corporation have championed, and now every local government in Perth and Peel have policies that support people gardening on their verge. And in fact, the Water Corporation required local governments to do this if they were going to be able to access annual grant schemes for subsidising verge plantings. And we've gone one step further and also worked with Water Corporation to deliver the Waterwise Streetscape Guidelines, which is getting people to think beyond just their verge and seeing how can we take a neighbourhood scale approach to this. Also their Drainage for Livability program, which is about how they can better utilise their green infrastructure around main drains for improved biodiversity. And I'll show a case study towards the end. And then finally, the real heroes are within the community. And we're seeing that through urban bushland groups who have been the champions of often underfunded bushland and wetland care, the participation in the development of the urban forest strategies and action plans within local governments, and also advocates like the WA Tree Canopy Advocacy Group, who are showing amazing leadership to help raise the importance of how do we preserve, if not increase, urban tree canopies. There's also lots of innovation happening in this space. Guess what? Gardening and arboriculture, horticulture are not static things. We're seeing lots of innovation and improved practices. Sometimes starting at a pretty low bar, but we are seeing things move in the right direction. We're seeing a great deal of increase in arboricultural expertise here in Western Australia within industry. We're seeing much better nursery practices and adoption of national standards to make sure that the plant stock that is grown, particularly trees, are grown well to be good long-term specimens. We're seeing a lot of development and expertise in green infrastructure, including podium gardens, so that's rooftops and above structures like car parks and so forth. And we're seeing an enormous amount of improvements in design, creativity, and a willingness for industry to want to do more. This is all positive. How about a couple of case studies? So I'll start with an urban residential infill project. Now, apologies if some of these are slightly Fremantle-centric, so I know we're slightly out of Curtin, but that's where I live now, so it's always nice to find projects to work on that are near my practice and my home. This is a project led by our State Government Development Agency, Development WA, 115 Hamilton Hill on the former Hamilton Senior High School site, which closed down in 2018 and merged with South Fremantle College to become Fremantle College. And the site was earmarked for residential infill development to help meet the state's infill development target. In 2021, the Stage 1 civil works were completed, and now Stage 1 housing construction is just about done. This project is a significant leadership project across a range of sustainability areas. I'll focus mainly on the urban greening aspects, but it is a net zero urban development, and it is all electric, no fossil gas. Design guidelines require all the homes to operate at minimum 7.5 star NAHES, generate more power than they use over the course of the year. And see the old school there? That was actually deconstructed, processed on site with a 96% resource recovery on site, with materials going back into build, all of the civil works and landscape infrastructure, including road base and drainage rock, with all of that valuable materials used in higher order purposes across the site. And in doing so, avoided 1,000 truck movements through the local neighbourhood to get rid of that material, to stockpiling and to bring new material back. So there's a whole range of ways we can do things better, but I'll focus on the urban greening. So the first thing we did here, and fortunately, is the landscape architects and sustainability consultants for the project, and in due course this will become another research project for Curtin to assess the efficacy of the initiatives that have been put in place. The first thing we do is look at regional connectivity. So there's no point doing urban greening initiatives for biodiversity benefits on an ad hoc basis. We need to zoom up, understand what those connections are. As it turns out, this site backed right onto the former Row 8 and Row 9 road reserve that was destined for clearing. In fact, when we were planning it, the clearing of that site had just started under the former state government. Thankfully, change of government happened, it stopped, and now that's being moved across to be a regional reserve. But we've tapped into that site to go, okay, well, what are the opportunities to connect to that local context and local ecology? So we do that by, firstly, retaining the trees, recognising that the trees have enormous amenity value, but also have habitat value. But beyond that, we need to build an understory and we need to connect these spaces. So the overall public realm or development scale initiatives here were around being very clear that we wanted to provide quality amenity, mitigate urban heat. This part of Hamilton Hill is in a identified urban heat risk area because of the nature of the surrounding landscape, low tree canopy and poor housing stock and demographic. So mitigating urban heat was important and then providing habitat. So there's a range of things we do. Building on the tree retention, retaining landform to enable the trees to be retained, allocating 17% open space above the standard 10%, but making sure that this is distributed and connected. So there's plenty of playing reserves and large-scale pickabout spaces in the area. This is about local neighbourhood greening for connectivity, which is so well attuned to medium density infill. Setting a tree canopy target of 30% at maturity, which is double the pre-development amount, and that's spread 20% within public realm and 10% within private realm. Water-sensitive urban design for the stormwater management, so trying to get water to infiltrate near where it falls, to hydrate the landscape, to hydrate the root zone, to ensure long-term water availability to plants, to increase transpiration and urban cooling. Putting in a community bore scheme which provides groundwater not only to the public realm landscapes but actually reticulates that to all the houses as well. And because of the localised stormwater capture, we've demonstrated that we can do that on a sustainable basis for less cost and a lot less emissions than the alternative, which was to rely on scheme water for all of the private space irrigation. Of course, native plant palette and habitat structures incorporated through all of the pocket parks and POSs. And these habitat structures range from things like nesting boxes for different target species, black cockatoos, owls, parvolotes, also microbats, and even quenda tunnels across all the roads, so the quendas can move from the vegetated streetscapes into private gardens as well. So that's the public realm, but how about the private space? How do we deal with the private space? Well, we do that through a local development plan and good design guidelines. And both the LDP and the DGs were modelled off, guess what? The ill-fated medium density code. And we actually prepared this because the MDC was in consultation for way too long. And I was fortunate to be involved in some of that consultation process. And they're very, very good. Some very smart people worked on those. And so we said, okay, Development WA, let's use these as the basis for the design guidelines for 115 to test industry's willingness to use them and to see how they're received. And broadly speaking, very well. So the design guidelines require check-offs at planning and pre-building and then at completion to make sure that a range of sustainability initiatives across energy and water and materials are covered. But I'll focus here primarily on the landscaping items. So these guidelines require some pretty sensible things to be met. So the objectives are to minimise heat gain and storage within private gardens, to increase stormwater infiltration and to provide shade and create habitat. And we do that by setting limits on the amount of hard stand, so we ensure that there's room for infiltration, by ensuring that there's a limit on how much of the hard stand is unshaded so we don't get these local heat island areas. Because this is not just a private issue, it's a neighbourhood issue. Ensuring that at least that there's a limit set rather on the amount of lawn to encourage shrubs and trees and ground covers and perennial vegetation, and that 25% of the outdoor area, not just the garden beds, of the area is set aside for deep root zone so we can maintain healthy tree canopies into the future. And there's guidance on the right types of trees, deciduous trees on the northern side, for example, evergreens elsewhere, and issues like overshadowing are all considered. And of course, no artificial turf on verges. Now you think that would be a no-brainer, but people still like to do it. So that's an example of a residential medium density infill project, a multi-typology. So in stage 1 there are detached lots, there are attached lots, there's group housing, there are split level lots, there's terrace homes, so 70 dwellings all up, well under construction, and now we're moving into stage 2 design. But let's move to WGV here and have a quick look at what happens when we start to use spaces that are otherwise underutilised more effectively. So this is the sump on Hope Street in WGV. The building there is a 12 unit building for, it's a social housing or affordable housing project for artists and creatives. Behind it on the corner of the site was a classic 1950s engineering solution to managing stormwater, a big sump. So as part of the project to help leverage off the density and soften the area, that was redesigned to have the stormwater going through gross pollutant traps into underground infiltration storage, and then that sump was then landscaped. So what was previously fenced off, full of environmental weeds and very unsightly, is now an accessible piece of green space open to the community. And you can see now the trees are establishing on that south side elevation. Eventually, the tulips and the flooded gums that are in there will grow up and screen that building, and people are looking out into tree canopy. And so that's a 2,000 cubic metre storage basin with half of that water now underground, and only in extreme events does it bubble up. So to finish off, how do we then tackle serious green infrastructure and serious stormwater drainage infrastructure? So this is Wharf Street Basin. I mentioned briefly the Drainage for Livability program that Water Corporation runs. So this is one of the stormwater assets that they manage. It takes stormwater from a surrounding regional catchment and it drains into the Canning River. And this basin is, again, about a 60, 70-year-old engineering asset, which is a compensation basin. So unlike the local City of Fremantle example, which is a dry basin that only gets wet when it rains heavily, this is full year round because it intersects with the groundwater. This was fenced off since it was built. It was very poor water quality, low habitat value, unfortunately a lot of social issues in and around there, and look at the urban development adjacent to it, all turning its back on it. The reason it's so valuable, one, there's water in a dry place, let's make the most of that. Two, it's on the edge of the City of Canning's future city centre master plan area. So Water Corporation partnered with the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attraction, all who have different jurisdictional considerations over this site, but it was led by City of Canning as local government to actually beautify that. We're very fortunate, my team were appointed as the landscape architects to redesign this, and now it's a wonderful piece of public open space with connection from one side of the street across to the other, across the wetland, right into the future city centre site for pedestrians and bike riders, tens of thousands of rushes and sedges, hundreds of trees that will eventually be at full canopy, and designed to show that these often unloved, forgotten spaces will be the heroes of our denser cities. So yes, we need to look at how we do public realm and private landscaping better, but there is so much underutilised, forgotten space that becomes viable through the economics of good quality urban infill. So let's not just think about the bad stuff, let's get creative and see how we can do it better. Thank you very much.